So let's go into some of these different interfaces a little bit more specifically in a little bit more detail. So on the left-hand side, I have my project navigator. Again, I can close that and open that simply by clicking project over here. And I can collapse these different folders. I can also find my actual file here. I can right-click it and do various different things, such as running it here, debugging it. I can find where it's used. I can analyze it. I can add it to a favorites list, which is what I like to do personally. I'll give it a name like main activity file. And now it's easy to just click favorites and grab it. I can do all kinds of different things. I can mark it for plain text and not for code. I can reformat it. I can see its history. I can compare it with an existing file on something like GitHub. So this is really just like our file manager, just like anything else. Like whenever you're using, for example, Finder or something like that. I'm going to collapse that view for now so that I have a larger central view. And in this central view, I have my activity _ main.xml file, and I have my main activity.kotlin file. I'm going to start with the Kotlin file, the code. So this is the code that is linked directly to this activity. And an activity you can think of as a view or a screen of your application. One view is one activity. If I moved, let's say I tapped a button and it took me to a new screen, that would be a separate activity. So this code file is directly connected to this user interface file. And this user interface file in actuality looks like this. If I click text at the bottom, it brings up this. It's an XML file. So Kotlin is one language that we're learning. XML is one that we're not going to learn in this class, but frankly, you could learn it in about 5 minutes. XML deals with basically organizing structures of data. It's a very simple language, it's very human readable, and it's existed for a very long time. It tells us things like, where these different pieces of the layout are. It's saying, hey, here's this text file. It has these constraints applied to it, telling us where its position is. For example, it's saying constraint vertical bias 0.227. Let's move it and see if that number changes. Now it changed to 0.099. If I move it down here, it'll change to a higher number, 0.094. So as I move it around, I'm adjusting this value right here, the vertical bias, and this value, the horizontal bias. So you can think of this as like the visual representation of this text right here. But it's important that you remember that this text always exists, okay? Even if you're designing your things visually, you still need to keep in mind that in the background, there's all of this text that's working with you. This is important because, for example, in my design, if I add an element that doesn't have constraints or has some sort of other property, and I don't think about, is that actually connected if I just make an assumption? For example, this is an easy one that we'll fix a little bit later. If I drop a button in my view and I was to run this, whenever I run this, this button would actually just be placed in the upper left-hand corner because if I look at the XML, I haven't given this button any sort of information other than the absolute position of it. The reason I'm talking about all of this, and it may seem like a lot of info at the beginning, because I want you to keep in mind that these two files exist in conjunction, all right? I'm going to go ahead and just delete that button now. So I'm going to hop back to my design view, and let's talk about this view a little bit more. So this is my main activity. And this is where I'm going to build my user interface. So right now I have these two kind of views. I have this white view and this blue view. This is called a blueprint, and this is our actual design. I can change this by going up here and clicking this little button that looks like kind of stacks and layers, and I can change it to just a design view or just a blueprint view. The blueprint view just gives us a little bit more information on what's going on here. For example, it's giving me the constraint around this text view, which is just basically a piece of text, but it's showing me how big that text box actually is. Whereas if I'm in design view, all I see is the text sort of existing on its own. I don't see the true details in the blueprint. Now, I like to work in both. I like to flip back and forth. I actually am not a fan of this double view. I find it kind of confusing and that I can't quite keep my things straight. So I'm going to work in the blueprint view and then flip back to the design view. So that's essentially what this button does. Next to that, we have different previews, such as, do we want to view it in landscape? Do we want to view it in portrait? Different UI modes, such as, is it in a car dock, a desk dock? Is it part of a television? Like Android TV, things like that. The night mode, so is it in night mode? Which I don't think will change anything for us now, no. But it might make the interface more orange, for example. And we can also create variations in this view, like if we wanted our landscape view to be very different than our other view. Here's the device that we're previewing it on. So this interface is being previewed for a Pixel running 5.0, or 5-inch device, sorry, that is of this size and this many DPI. So if I wanted to preview this on a Pixel 2 XL, I would click that and switch it around. Next to that, we have the version of Android that we're using. I only have one installed, so we're using that. We have the app theme if we have a bar or a material action bar, things like that. We're not going to worry about it too much. Over here, we have our language, or encoding, really. So basically, this doesn't mean much to us, but we're going to leave it on English. This is how zoomed in we are to our actual device. Below that, we have some different views that we can turn on and off. For instance, we can show our constraints, which we'll get into what constraints are in a future video, but we can actually see them all the time, or we can see them never. We can show layout decorations, which again, we'll talk about a little bit more, but that's whenever we have the home buttons and the top bar button, the top bar for our named activities. This is kind of standard to leave these on, so I actually leave those on all the time. Next to that, we have whether or not they're snapping. We have how the snapping is working, how there's different constraints. If we want to clear them, if we want to automatically add constraints, and if we want to add guidelines, like basically guides from Photoshop and Illustrator and things like that. So it's a very easy to use interface. There's not too many buttons over here, but these are kind of just, how we actually view the system changes based on these two bars. So on the left-hand side, we have our palette, and our palette is where we're going to have all of our user interface items. These are things like our button, which we just click and drag and drop into the scene, and it generates a button. We can see that over here on the left-hand side, there's different categories such as text, buttons, widgets, layouts, which basically involves constraints, containers, certain things like Google Ad View and Map View, and some legacy options that we're not going to be using in this class. So typically we'll just use the things in common, but we're going to add more and more as we play with this. So I've added a button to my scene, and again, I do that just by simply dragging and dropping it into the scene. And I can see that it has various options on it. You can play with those, but essentially these deal with how the constraints work. This is the size of our button. But we can get to these things a little more clearly by looking at the right-hand side in the attribute editor. In our attribute editor, we can see the ID of the button, which is the name that we're actually going to reference in our code. If we add any declared attributes to it, which we're not going to, but if we do that, that'll be here. The layout constraints, so if we want to have a top constraint, side constraints, essentially holding it in place. Again, we'll get into these more in a future video. The width, the height, things like that. Some common attributes, such as the styling. So if we created some custom styling, such as a borderless, or if we wanted to do, let's say, colored, we can change that here. On click is where we're going to give it our actual actions. We'll be doing that in a future video. The background, so what's the background actually look like? The background tint, which we can change here too. If I click this little button right here, by the way, it'll actually pull up different things for us to use, different menus. So if I click this background, it'll pull up different background images I can use, or different colors. If there's any text on here, for example, it says button right now, I could say hi, And it should update. It says hi. Text settings and formatting. Again, I can click that to pull up some of the various options. I can also click this to format the text directly. Content descriptions. The text appearance, which if I twirl this down, it pulls up things like the size, the fonts, typeface. Down here we have the component tree, which basically deals with how all this stuff is laid out in our scene. So if I want to quickly select the text view, I can click it here. If I want to click the button, I would click it here. And if I go to my text, I can actually see how all of that looks. So that's really simply the design view in a nutshell.